Hello and welcome. I'm Lucy Fisher, Chief Political Commentator at Times Radio and an Associate Fellow at RUSI. I'm delighted to be chairing this event today with John Healey, the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence. As you will know as members, RUSI's vision is to be a world-leading independent forum for improving and informing policy and public debate on defence, security and international affairs. So it's a very warm welcome to John, since contributions such as the speech we're about to hear from him are vital to the discussion about Britain's place in the world. A couple of quick housekeeping notes first. If everyone could please turn their phones and electronic devices to silent. For those here in person at the Institute of Directors, in the event of an emergency, staff will direct you to the relevant fire exits. And please be aware that this is an exclusive event for RUSI members that is a hybrid event, so there will be people joining online. And if you are joining online, please be aware you can start asking questions straight away using the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen. John will give a speech first, followed by questions from the floor and online. So, as many of you will know, John is one of the most experienced MPs in the Labour Party. He was first elected in 1997 for the South Yorkshire seat of Wentworth and Dean. He served in the governments of both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, first as Adult Skills Minister, before joining the Treasury, and then serving as Minister of State for Local Government and later for Housing and Planning. He's held the Shadow Cabinet briefs for Health and Housing previously, but since April 2020, he has, of course, presided over the defence portfolio. John is here today as we approach the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine to discuss how a future Labour government will tackle its defence priorities. I know he wants to talk about how the UK should remedy what he sees as flaws in the integrated review, outline the Labour Party's vision for defence, and share his broader thinking on required adjustments in European security. So, John, I cede the floor to you.
Lucy, thank you. Lovely introduction, but what she really means is when she says I'm one of the most experienced Labour politicians, she means I've been around a long time. But thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for your interest and your attendance tonight, and a special thank you to RUSI for hosting us here in the IOD. The whole country's concerned that government gets decisions on defence and security right, and I know that this is what motivates many of you in this audience to make your contributions to public policy and debate, and I thank you also for this. In my last speech to RUSI, I set out a series of tests for the government's integrated review, 1 month before it was published in March 21. Now, before next month's integrated review and spring budget, I aim to do the same. Now, back in 2021, I also outlined Labour's 4 core principles on defence and security. Our unshakable commitment to NATO and the UK's nuclear deterrent. Our highest priority is the UK's security in Europe, the North Atlantic and the Arctic, our NATO area. Our dedication to international law and human rights and to the institutions and treaties that uphold them. And our determination to direct British defence investment first to British business with a higher bar for decisions to buy abroad. Now, these Labour principles have not changed, but the world has. What the integrated review in March 2021 described as a new era of systemic competition has blown up into the largest war in Europe since 1945. The UN's Charter prohibition on changing international boundaries by force, the central principle of our current global order, has been brutally disregarded. So we have war in Europe, a Chinese build-up around Taiwan, the collapse of the Western presence in Afghanistan, a total withdrawal from Mali, and the Iran nuclear deal in danger. While war narrows the space for international cooperation, the world still needs to tackle the global problems that confront us all: climate change, growing food poverty, mass refugees, pandemic infections, and economic protectionism. This is why David Lammy recently outlined Labour's vision for Britain reconnected. Now, David and I both served in the last Labour government. We're good friends, which helped, and we work very closely together as Labour's shadow Foreign Secretary and Labour's shadow Defence Secretary. We know that sound defence is sound foreign policy, as George Robertson said in Labour's 1998 Strategic Defence Review. So that's why the first goal of the FCDO's mission under a Labour government is for Britain to reconnect to defend the UK's security with strong armed forces and resilience against 21st century threats. Now, reflecting on Ukraine, especially as we're approaching the first anniversary since President Putin launched his illegal invasion. A bloody milestone and a grave moment. In Kyiv, before the invasion last year, their former Prime Minister, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, told David and me, Western unity is Ukraine's best defence. And we told him then there would be total unity in the United Kingdom, total solidarity with Ukraine, and total condemnation of Russia. Because we understood Putin's aim is not simply to take Ukraine. We're facing a dictator ready to use armed force to redraw the map of Europe. He displays contempt for international institutions, humanitarian law, rules of military conflict. He wants to destroy the unity of the West. And a year on, there is no sign that Putin's strategic aims have changed. Russia is far from being a spent force, despite the massive damage that Ukraine has inflicted on its military. And Putin is expanding his war effort, massing troops and firepower to launch future offensives with his defence industry on a wartime production. And of course, Ukraine has been fighting Russia for 9 years, not one. This is long term. And the next government will inherit the Ukraine conflict and Russian aggression. So with a general election, there may be a change in government, but there will be no change in Britain's resolve to confront Russia's threats, to pursue Putin's war crimes, and to stand with Ukraine. Now, the UK's crisis response to Ukraine has certainly been strong, and I give credit to the Defence Secretary for the action he's taken since the invasion. I welcome the 2.3 billion that the government has allocated for Ukraine last year and this year, and the 560 million for stockpiles. On Britain's military help to Ukraine and on reinforcing NATO allies on the Russian border, the government has had, and it will continue to have, Labour's fullest support. But ministers must now move from ad hoc announcements to more systematic support. And that's why I've been arguing for ministers to set out a full 2023 action plan on military, economic, humanitarian, diplomatic assistance, because this will help give Ukrainians confidence in a sustained supply to them. It will help urgently ramp up our own industry. It will help others to do more. And above all, it will signal to Putin that things will get worse, not better, for Russia. As a former national security advisor told me recently, Ukraine changes everything. And in truth, there's been a void in government vision about what next. No country comes out of a war as it went in. And there's been strategic inertia from British ministers over any domestic or international rethink. The central question is, can this government rise to respond to this challenge in next month's integrated review and spring budget? Or are they too concerned with the week-to-week survival to face the major decisions to secure the country's future? consider this. Since the invasion, 25 other NATO nations have already rebooted their defence plans and budgets. Chancellor Scholz discarded decades-long German policy and has boosted defence spending by €100 billion. President Macron has promised the same budget increase in France. Poland, Estonia, Lithuania will all raise spending to 3% of GDP on defence this year. Finland, Sweden have overturned decades of non-alignment and applied to join NATO. But a year on, where's Britain's reboot in defence planning or spending? Now, Labour's been arguing for this since last March, not just to respond to Putin's invasion, but to fix the flaws in the integrated review, which were clear before Ukraine, but have become clearer since. So we welcomed Prime Minister Liz Truss's announcement of an IR update. This was first promised before the end of last year, now due before the budget on the 15th of March. She also planned and promised to spend 3% of GDP on defence by 2030, although I think you have to say this has proved to be no more than a pitch to help win the Tory leadership election. Because I say this, we must judge ministers on their actions and not on their words. And since the invasion, there has been no new money for the defence budget. None. There was no new money for defence in Kwasi Kwarteng's £160 billion mini-budget. No new money for defence in Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement. In fact, as the Conservatives have crashed the economy, weakened the pound and sent inflation soaring, these pressures have squeezed defence budgets even further at a time when threats are increasing. And of course, it's not just how much you spend, but how well you spend it. And over £5 billion has been wasted since 2019 alone in poor MOD procurement. And this is failing British troops, it's failing British taxpayers. So, like you, we look forward to the budget next month, when the Chancellor has promised, and I quote, "The Prime Minister and I both recognise the need to increase defence spending." Together, next month's integrated review and budget will show whether this government has the strength to secure the country's future, or whether they'll fudge the finances and delay the difficult decisions until after the next election. So let me turn, as Lucy promised, to the integrated review. What the last integrated review got right, what it got wrong, and what needs to change in the new integrated review. And I think when we look back at the IR, there were many positives which we need to preserve. Britain certainly needed a statement of UK grand strategy post-Brexit. We certainly have great strengths to draw on, so we should have the national ambition to become a science and tech superpower by 2030. The IR rightly said state threats to the UK are increasing and diversifying. It identified Russia as the most acute direct threat, and it identified China as a systemic competitor. This designation given to China should stand. It's well grounded, it's consistent with our allies' approach in NATO. And of course, there was also a need before the IR to increase defence spending on equipment and on infrastructure to catch up on a decade of cuts since 2010. But what the IR, let's say, got wrong. There were serious flaws in the IR. It was trumpeted by Boris Johnson as a national tilt to the Indo-Pacific, economic, diplomatic, trade and military. So there was no vision for the UK's leading role in NATO. Conservative ministers could barely bring themselves to mention the European Union. So by taking defence and security out of the Brexit negotiations, Boris Johnson has left a Europe-shaped hole in British security strategy. It was heavy on the go-it-alone view of global Britain. So there was insufficient recognition that Britain is always a bigger force for good when we act with allies. The 2021 IR failed to foresee the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan 4 months later, or anticipate that Putin could invade Ukraine within a year. And I say this not to be wise after the event, but to make the important point that we were unprepared for such possible future conflicts, which is a failure of military and political leadership. Importantly, the government's strategic objectives in the IR were undermined also by the IR process itself, by spending cuts that were decided at the same time, and by a mismatch between the IR strategy and departmental plans. The last IR was largely conducted behind closed doors, and even within government, it was anything but integrated. Work was carried out in silos. So some decisions like merging DFID were taken entirely outside the integrated review, and there's no mention in the integrated review of how the FCDO was going to deal with the sudden cuts in overseas development assistance that are so damaging to the UK's reputation as a reliable international partner. With threats increasing, the IR boasted Britain's military will pursue persistent global engagement, and yet the MOD is cutting another 10,000 troops, scrapping Hercules planes, and dropping down to 148 Challenger tanks. These are the troops reinforcing NATO allies, the planes used in the Kabul airlift, the tanks being sent to Ukraine. And that 16.5 billion pre-IR boost in defence capital spending was quickly swallowed up by the MOD's budget black hole, leading the National Audit Office in November to say the government cannot currently afford to develop all the capabilities set out in the 2021 integrated review. So for the new integrated review, let me offer you these thoughts and perhaps these tests. Above all, the UK's strategic priorities have to be clear this time. The gung-ho promotion of global Britain, which too often means anywhere but Europe, must end. This is no time for ideology to drive policy. Labour accepts Brexit. We will not be rejoining the European Union, the single market, or the customs union. But the Tories' post-Brexit blind spot on Europe must be corrected, and we must rebuild relationships with our European allies to make Brexit work. This is why Labour will seek a defence and security pact with the European Union and new defence agreements with leading European allies like Germany. On NATO, Britain's security strategy must be NATO first. The first priority for Britain's armed forces must be where the threats are greatest and not where the business opportunities lie. This is in the NATO area: Europe, the North Atlantic, the Arctic. And this is also our primary obligation to our closest allies. Now, after Ukraine, European allies will have to take on more responsibility for European security. So the IR update must secure Britain as NATO's leading European nation, which will be a Labour mission in government. It must outline the contribution that the UK will make to NATO as it focuses on future Russian aggression, the Arctic opening up with climate change, and a strategy to challenge and compete with China. And it must ensure that our NATO obligations are fulfilled in full, answering the growing questions about critical capabilities that undermine the UK's commitment to the alliance. The size of the British Army, problems with Ajax, delays to Wedgetails, doubts about fielding a warfighting division. And on the Indo-Pacific, I think the broad Western coalition imposing sanctions on Russia has shown that some of our strongest, some of our most reliable allies are in the Asia-Pacific. We share their concerns about China's growing military power and assertiveness. We should support them in full with UK technology, capability, diplomacy, and of course, with close defence cooperation like on AUKUS and the Tempest Future Fighter programme. However, our Indo-Pacific military commitments need realism. British armed forces are ill-served by leaders pretending we can do everything everywhere, especially as over the last 13 years, UK full-time forces have been cut by over 45,000. 1 in 5 of our surface Navy ships have been scrapped, and more than 200 RAF planes have been taken out of service. And just as we would not expect Japan or Australia to deploy much of their military to Europe, nor does it make sense, especially at this moment, for UK forces to devote an increasing share of their scarce resources to the Indo-Pacific. And I just make this point. Responding to the challenges of China goes beyond what we do in the Indo-Pacific. Security is not regional, but global. And as NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said last week in Japan, Ukraine demonstrates how security is interconnected, demonstrates how what happens in Europe has a consequence for East Asia, and also what happens in East Asia matters for Europe. Finally, turning to the state of our armed forces. It was the Defence Secretary himself conceded to me in the Commons last week that over the last 13 years, he said, we have hollowed out and underfunded our forces. This is an astonishingly frank admission of failure. Time and again, visible capabilities, especially large, expensive platforms, which would only come into service in the long term, were given priority over effective capabilities needed for military use here and now. Time and again, a modernised warfighting division has been promised, but always a decade away. Today, the biggest risk facing the UK military is that large parts of it are underprepared for conventional conflict in Europe, lacking spare parts, ammunition, skilled personnel. Now, of course, NATO is rightly doing what it can to avoid escalation into direct conflict with Russia, but deterring such escalation means that we have to be prepared for it. So like 2021, alongside the integrated review, we should have a new defence command paper. And this must make clear how we meet NATO's demand for greater force commitments, and it should halt further cuts to the British Army. There is also a need, an immediate need, for a stockpile strategy to sustain support for Ukraine and to rearm Britain. Quite simply, Ukraine is depleting our military stockpiles and the government is acting too slowly to replace them. Take the NLAW anti-tank missiles, so vital to Ukraine in turning back the Russian invasion. It was 287 days after the invasion before the MOD got its act together to sign a new contract for new NLAWs. And the first newly made UK NLAWs are not due until 2024. So we need to shift parts of the defence industry and our MOD procurement onto an urgent operational requirement, onto an urgent operational footing, both to support Ukraine in the long term and to rebuild UK stocks for any future conflict. These concerns will be the basis for Labour's own strategic defence and security review within the first year of government. But let me end where I started. The war in Ukraine is raging now. Global threats and challenges are increasing now. And Britain needs a national strategy which is relentlessly pragmatic and patriotic in promoting the security and prosperity of our people. That's why we want the government to get this new integrated review right. And if it does, then Labour will be the first to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. There is so much there to get into, and I'm hopeful of a very lively discussion. I'm going to use my prerogative as chair to ask the first question, and I think you possibly won't be surprised that I'm keen to pin you down on what Labour would do around defence spending. What percentage of GDP would a Labour government spend on defence?
I think the simple answer, Lucy, is that Labour will always spend what's required to defend Britain. But what's required depends on the threats. And that's why we'll undertake a defence and security review in our first year in government. It's only on that basis that you can make the assessment and fix firm figures. But I would just say to you this. In 2010, Labour's last year in government, we were spending 2.5% of our GDP on defence. And that's a level that's never been matched in any year since. And when you set that out alongside a determination to ensure that we drive deep procurement reform, which is required to deal with some of the waste, and we would commission on day one the National Audit Office to do an across-the-board audit of waste in the MOD. We would make the MOD the first department subject to our new Office for Public Value for Money. These are steps, I think, that will give us a good basis, a good strategic basis to make those budget decisions in government.
So just to clarify, you're not necessarily even guaranteeing that a Labour government would increase spending from its current base, either in percentage terms of GDP or in real terms?
The first duty of any government is to defend the country. In order to do that, you've got to meet the threats. You've got to assess the threats to assess the budget and fix the budget required. I've made very clear, and the government has said so too, that threats are increasing and diversifying. I don't expect that to change in the new integrated review. The Chancellor himself has said that the country needs to increase spending on defence. That's why we're looking forward to the budget. And that's why we've welcomed the spending that the government has been prepared to make to catch up on a decade of cuts in 2020. And that's why we've welcomed also the extra funding that's there for Ukraine last year and this year.
Right, we'll take some questions from the floor. There's a microphone going around, and if you could state your name and affiliation. Johnny.
Thank you. Could I just follow up on Lucy's question? I mean, you have highlighted in your speech that 25 nations in NATO have increased defence spending. You've made an implicit criticism of the UK government that it has not increased defence spending since the war in Ukraine. So it's a very simple question. Would Labour increase defence? I'm not asking for, I understand the difficulties of giving a specific figure, but would you, yes or no, increase spending on defence?
I'm arguing now, 18 months ahead of an election, threats are increasing, defence spending should be increasing. We need to reboot Britain's defence plans. We need to boost production of our weapons and ammunition, both to sustain our support for Ukraine and to ensure that we can replenish the supplies that our British forces need. It's quite clear that with threats increasing, we need to be increasing our defence spending. That's a decision confronting this government next month, which is the argument I've been making tonight, that's the test, the combination of are they prepared to make the major decisions to secure the future of the country in the integrated review, and are they prepared to make the major decisions in the spring budget, as they regularly promised but regularly also failed to do.
So the answer is, if you were in power now, you would increase defence spending, correct?
If this was our first day of Labour government, we'd be launching a strategic defence and security review. Well, Lucy was kind enough to say that I've done a number of jobs in government. I've been Shadow Secretary of State for Health, Shadow Secretary of State for Housing. Right? Now, those were areas where the big mismatch between government and opposition is apparent, but the asymmetry of dealing with defence and security, where all the information you need about costs, all the information you need about threats, all the information you need about adversaries' activities, all the information you need about your own country's capabilities are not available to us. Now, in principle, of course, we'll increase defence spending to meet the threats. But if you're pressing me for a figure and to fix that ahead of the election, that cannot be done.
I'm going to alternate with questions that are streaming in online as well. So, John, this one is from Bailey Denyer, who says, you mentioned about establishing a new European Security Pact. Surely this role has historically been undertaken by NATO. What will this pact deliver that NATO cannot, and with whom?
It's a good question, and of course the cornerstone of our defence and security is NATO, and NATO, post-Ukraine, could be playing a much bigger role. I'd like to see Britain arguing the case in NATO, for instance, to standardise some of the weapon specifications, so our interoperability is much greater in the field. I'd like to see it coordinating some of the cooperation needed on industrial production. But the European Union is indisputably now, and Ukraine has reinforced this, a significant agency in the security field. So, for instance, on sanctions, on some of the regulations over and prohibitions over supply chains, on some of the industrial coordination and support. These are all things, and on data exchanges, these are all things that fall within the European Union competence, that have a relevance to our security and the European Union's security and defence, where we have areas of common interest, we have mutual contributions to make, where if we want to rebuild relationships with some of our leading European allies, damaged during the Brexit process, sometimes deliberately so, then defence and security is an obvious area to try and establish cooperation, establish arrangements for ways of working, and possibly institutional agreements, which David Lammy and I have both spoken about as a defence and security pact.
Take a question with this gentleman in the front row. You, then you.
John Wilson, a member of RUSI and 3 other think tanks. Mr. Healy, I put it to you that Putin invaded Ukraine not because he perceived NATO as being strong, but he perceived it as being weak. Whilst NATO has talked tough on Ukraine, its aid has been too little and too late, and that Mr. Putin is likely in the long run to win as a consequence of our vacillation. Do you agree?
Not entirely. I think his invasion of Ukraine was obviously based on the recognition that Ukraine is not in NATO, but it was based on a miscalculation that the unity of the West and the unity of the NATO members to act independently but coordinated within NATO was one of his basic miscalculations. That, alongside obviously the miscalculation on the determination of the Ukrainians to fight for their country, fight for their future, and fight the latter-day colonial ambitions that Putin had to destroy Ukraine as a country, eradicate its identity, and of course to seize some of its vital industries. So it's the unity of the West that has in part stood so strongly with Ukraine, and it's in part the bravery and determination of the Ukrainians that has meant we are approaching the first year anniversary since this invasion, with Ukraine having retaken a fifth of the territory that Putin seized after the 24th of February, a first year anniversary that very few expected to see, and certainly Putin didn't expect to see because he believed it would be over in days or weeks.
Hello, Dick Applegate. About 12 years in industry trying to be a little bit more agile, and before that 37 years in the military, very much with your last administration dealing with some interesting challenges. I'd welcome the fact that you're narrowing the focus, but I'd be grateful if you could clarify. You made no mention of potentially options in Africa, the Middle East, or perhaps also in the Indian subcontinent. And I ask that considering the nature of the demographic pressures, environmental issues, potential refugee movements that might occur, and therefore the need to deploy or at least reassure allies in those regions. And I ask that question because as a planner in the past, and I'm delighted to see emphasising NATO, but we could end up effectively with the equivalent of British Army of the Rhine, which is incapable of being deployed easily into those other theatres. So I wonder if you could talk to me a little, and others here, a little bit about what your aspirations might be for those areas and how that might impact on force design and your funding requirements in order to give you, if you come into administration, options in order to meet the unexpected.
I think in part for time, I didn't go into the fears that I have. I mentioned the total withdrawal from Mali. I'm extremely concerned about the spread of extremist Islamic terror groups across sub-Saharan Africa, and strongly supported our deployment to Mali when we went in there alongside the French and the UN peacekeeping force. That's an essential role for the British forces, in my view, that sort of activity. It helps to reinforce our position as a leading P5 member of the United Nations when we can contribute significant capabilities as we did in Mali that nobody else could. And it is part of our contribution to a more stable rules-based order. So it would be wrong to characterize either what we need in the future or the argument I was making tonight that somehow I'm looking for a Mark II Army of the Rhine.
I'm glad to see that the former First Sea Lord and your parliamentary colleague, Admiral Lord West, is beaming in remotely. He asks you, could you confirm that within NATO, the UK is the premier European navy, that the alliance relies on that capability, and that maintenance of maritime access to our island in war is, in the final analysis, crucial to our survival?
Yes, Lord West always keeps an eye on me. The short answer is yes, and we don't talk enough about the maritime leadership the British provides. We don't talk enough about Northwood and the command that we have of the NATO maritime fleet. So Lord West is right, and we are in the end an island nation. We have a pivotal location in the North Atlantic, and especially with the Arctic opening up. So our naval capabilities on the surface and below the surface are absolutely a critical part of our security for the future, but the capabilities that we need.
This lady over here.
Thank you. Sian Greszczyk, BFBS Forces News. In terms of troop numbers, because of the threats that you've outlined there, would a Labour government cut, maintain or increase troop numbers?
We would halt, as well, I've argued there, we'd halt the further cuts. At this time when the threats are increasing, when the demands of NATO are rising for high readiness forces, That's the first step. How we rebuild then the strength of our forces would depend on the assessments we make during that first year in a Labour government.
George.
Hi, George Grills, The Times. Troops received a significantly below inflation pay rise last year. Do you think soldiers are being paid fairly? And quickly, if I may, just because I wasn't clear on your defence spending comments earlier. So under Boris Johnson, he said that he was going to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. You said you supported that. Are you now saying situations have changed because of the fallout from the mini-budget under Liz Truss, or what's happened to that 2.5% support?
Well, what's happened to the 2.5% support is the same as what's happened to the 3% promise by 2030. These are promises that are easy to make, but are not being kept. It's why I argued there we've got to judge ministers on their actions and not their words. The current level of UK spend on defence is bumping along just above the 2% NATO target. It's 2.12%. That's the circumstance we're in. That's the challenge that the integrated review and the spring budget must face. And that's the argument I've been making tonight. And on pay? Soldiers paid fairly? I'm not entirely satisfied with the pay review arrangements for our forces, to be honest. They're in a unique position. Not only do they have no option to take the sort of action that other sets of workers do, and I'm certainly not advocating for that, but they have no way of raising their concerns and voicing their priorities. So I feel that there's a twofold requirement for any new government. One, I think we've got to renew the contract the nation has with those who serve and their families. And for me, that means fixing some of the deep-seated problems in housing. It means recognising the particular pressures that families have, particularly when they've got kids and schools. But I think it also means finding a way of ensuring that the forces outside the chain of command, without penalty, are able to speak up. And that's part of the proposals that I would be looking for Labour to be making going into the next election, and if we get into government, putting into place.
Matthew Palmer online, John asks you, on defence procurement, will Labour be content to buy overseas if it serves British defence better, on cost, capability, etc., than procuring equipment programmes from British firms, despite the potential political costs?
My first principle will be that I want to direct British taxpayers' money, British defence investment to our own businesses and our own jobs, not simply on a contract-by-contract basis, but on a proper strategic basis that looks not at just what we need to contract and procure now, but what we're going to need in 10 years' time. That gives us an opportunity to make longer-term commitments. It gives businesses an opportunity to make longer-term investments with greater confidence. It allows us to look at some of the essential supply chains and industries which are required to support our defence industry. Clearly, alongside that, you've got big development and procurement, which may require international cooperation, which I welcome. And where there are obvious capabilities which are needed and clearly better than what we can do in Britain, then there could be a good case for buying abroad. But I think the government in recent years has sometimes sold the pass on making sure that we get a sufficient work share in Britain, that we get some of the skills that we need in Britain and the jobs and the economic benefit in Britain that could come from actually buying from overseas. So I think there's a much tougher job to be done by British ministers, and that's the sort of emphasis and direction I would lead.
Liz.
Hiya. You said that China's designation in the integrated review as a systemic competitor should stand. What do you say to those people that we need to get tougher with Beijing?
If you're asking me whether I believe Britain should be designating China as a threat, which is an argument we hear in the House of Commons, particularly from the right of the Conservative Party, I think that's a mistake. I think the designation that the integrated review had with China as a systemic competitor, with all the complications and difficulties that presents, is soundly based. I don't want us stepping outside the approach of allies through NATO, and I think that's where Britain needs to be concentrating our effort in developing the sort of long-term strategic response we require from China.
The gentleman here. Sorry, just to the left.
Oh, apologies. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Haley. So, my name is Marwan, working at the Palestinian Mission. As we approach the 75 years anniversary of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, the day of displacing more than 700,000 Palestinians, Nakba, and in the light of the new Israeli far-right government and its response to, and the escalation that's happening in the Palestinian territories, and almost like 35 people have been killed since the beginning of just like that 2023 year. What is the Labour's defence policy regarding the Palestinian situation in the light of also the historic responsibility of the UK? Thank you.
I think we're all viewing the escalation of tension and conflict in Israel and the Palestinian Authority with great concern, but with great respect. I think the solutions lie in diplomacy and not with the British military.
The lady in the second row here.
Mr. Healy, Caroline Flynn-MacLeod. I'm a little perplexed. I hear you announce sort of a number of reviews. And we're going to have yet another root and branch review of defence if you become Secretary of State for Defence. You'll be asking the same people to review something that they've already reviewed, sort of twice since 2021 and again this year. Same people. You know what the threats are. You're briefed on Privy Council terms as to what the threats are, new, emerging, existing, whatever. Yet you still seem to be unable to say to us, I'm not a journalist to try and catch you out, but why can't you say to us how much you will increase defence spending by? I mean, it seems to be quite a simple answer because you spent your speech saying that we're not doing enough and everything you're suggesting suggests we need to spend more. So why can't you say what Labour will do and why you've got to have yet another review?
Because quite simply, you cannot fix those figures without making that assessment for yourself. You can't make that assessment without having access to the information that is highly classified. And it's a common misperception, but I have to tell you, I'm not briefed on the threats. I'm not briefed on the activities of adversaries. I'm not briefed or privy to the information about costs. I'm simply not. I am a Privy Council member. I've been for a long time. But that's a misunderstanding that the government gives me in the opposition any access. It is certainly the case that I and Keir Starmer have been briefed by the Chief of Defence Intelligence at the express permission of the Defence Secretary on developments in Ukraine. But that is no more than the best of open source information. That's the level of information that we're working with. Now, on the integrated review, your point would be right if we were looking to do another review using the same people in the same way. But if you think back to 1998, the 1998 Strategic Defence Review, led by George Robertson, that was done in an entirely different way. And part of my criticism tonight about the way that both times this government's conducted the integrated review, it's been behind closed doors. I've offered Labour to contribute to this new integrated review. That's been refused. Back in 1998, it was an open process. Those in the armed forces at all levels were encouraged to contribute. Those in industry at all levels were encouraged to contribute. Those in all sides of the political spectrum were invited to contribute. And so what you had then was if you like, a strategy for the country that was not simply the strategy and property of the ministers in government at the time. And by undertaking it in that way, you hardwired into its conclusions a consensus of support behind it, which made implementation that much easier. So that's the difference. That's the criticisms I've got of the process. But it's also why that's an essential step for any incoming government, because in this field, you simply can't do that work from opposition. Frustrating, I have to tell you, as it is.
I think we've got time just for two final quick questions, and the hands I can see are Robert and Ben. So we'll take both, and then...
Thank you very much. Very quickly, Lucy. John, 1998 review.
Robert, just wait for the microphone so people online can hear.
Sorry, Robert Fox. 1998 review. You know what the criticism was. It was never fully costed. It was a Christmas tree. We had aircraft carriers. I don't have to tell you that. What novel way, in other words, hasn't been tried before, can you ensure that it is costed properly? Leads me on to procurement. How on earth are you going to sort out the philosophy and conception of procurement policy in this country? You, your party, had Bernard Gray look at it, then he became head of DE&S. And still we have things like Ajax and Boxer. And finally, your point, as Caroline raised, about the IR. Who is it really for? Who are you trying to kid, Mr. Hitler, with this? Is it for the public? Is it for your own party? Is it for potential voters? For your friends and allies? Or your enemy? What is the purpose of it? Because they very rarely survive the first point of contact. The Australians have had 3 revisions, the Finns too. The French have just revised their strategic review with an increase of 40% expenditure over the next 5 years.
No, I think the purpose is very clear. It's very simple, really. It's to give the country some definition of the direction that its elected government believes it should go, and to give the elements within government, within industry, a framework within which it's possible to pull together. We've been lacking that over the last decade. I hope this integrated review can provide this, so it is a national strategy for Britain for the future. But that's the purpose of that sort of review, which is why doing it in the way it's been done weakens its likely results and conclusions. It could be done differently. If we were undertaking something like that as a Labour government, again, it would.
And finally, Ben.
Thank you. I'm Ben Glaze from the Daily Mirror. If an SDSR under a new Labour government recommended increasing troop numbers, increasing the number of Challenger tanks, would you be comfortable for taxes to rise to fund that extra spending?
Ben, to be fair to me, I think that's a question with so many what-ifs that I'm actually not going to answer that. Because one of the things that if you speak to Rachel Reeves, if you look at the priorities that Gordon Brown had when he was a Chancellor in that Labour government in 1997, and I was part of his team that produced 2 spending reviews, 6 budgets and 7 finance bills. Every year, his first priority was, what can we do that's going to improve growth and productivity? And you will find that Rachel Reeves, as a Labour Chancellor, brings exactly the same sort of determination from day one to any Labour government. So the sort of what-ifs on a economic performance in recent years that has had growth so low that has forced taxes up is simply not a proposition from where we are now that I think can give you a sensible answer. And I'm sorry if that's unsatisfactory, but it just is how it is.
Well, that's all we've got time for. I'd like to express my gratitude to everyone here, everyone who's been watching online, who's made it a great discussion. And of course, a huge thanks to you, John. We've learned a lot about what Labour would do regarding reviews. Not quite sure we pinned you down on spending, but fascinating as well about perhaps a little bit of a pivot away from the Indo-Pacific and concentrating on our own backyard. So just let everyone know, John has said he's available to stick around for 5-10 minutes and say hello, have a quick chat with RUSI members. But now if we could all give him a very warm round of applause.
Thank you all.